Hello, this time on Sitrep.
Look what happened. Is this crazy?
America has chosen, but all of us will be affected by the return of Donald Trump as Commander-in-Chief of the world's most powerful armed forces.
Want a strong and powerful military, and ideally we don't have to use it. You know, we had no wars. 4 years we had no wars.
As the closest of allies, the UK and US will continue to work together to protect our shared values of freedom and democracy.
Not everyone is convinced our values are that closely shared.
President-elect Trump praised Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and I quote, he called it genius. He also said he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to NATO allies.
But we are where we are. Now it's time for rhetoric to make way for reality. How could Trump 2.0 change the world? Well, there's a lot of explaining to do. So Mike and I have enlisted the help of a former UK National Security Advisor and a retired Commanding General of the US Army Europe.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
So, Mike, the old saying goes, America sneezes and the world catches a cold. US presidential elections are always consequential, but this one feels particularly so, not just because of who the victor is, but also what else is happening at this moment in history.
Yes. I mean, in 2016, it seemed to be an enormous surprise that Donald Trump won the presidency because nobody knew really what he really stood for. And they can't say that this time. So we know what his approach is. We know he has a plan. We know he has followers now. He thinks he understands the way Washington works and what he would like and what he won't like. And this is not just a victory. This is a triumph. I mean, Trump and Trumpism has triumphed in the American system. So the Americans, they know what they're doing. They know what they're getting. They know about him. And whereas, you know, people who didn't like Trump used to say, I mean, that they took him literally but not seriously, where his supporters took him seriously but not literally. They don't worry too much about what he says, but they respect the idea that he can handle power. Now, you know, whether that's true or not, we'll find out. But the fact is, this is a really consequential election because the American electorate know what they're getting, and they've decided by a pretty big majority that this is what they want to do.
Well, let's bring in our guest now. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges was Commanding General of the US Army Europe from 2014 to 2018 and joins us from Washington, D.C. And Sir Mark Lyall Grant, he's a former UK ambassador to the United Nations and was the UK's National Security Advisor when Donald Trump first won the presidency 8 years ago. Welcome to both of you. General Ben, we've discussed this as a possible scenario with you many times on Sitrep before. We know you are no fan of Donald Trump and didn't want this to happen. But in the cold light of day, what's your pragmatic risk assessment of the second Trump presidency for our defense and security?
So 3 things, Kate. First, I think it is important, of course, for all of us to acknowledge that Donald Trump has been elected by a convincing majority, exactly as Michael just said. And so whether or not that's the outcome I wanted or many people wanted, that's the will of the American people. And so I can't be a fan of democracy only when my side wins. And so I will continue to do all I can to defend and protect that democracy and what's embodied in our Constitution. And I will encourage my fellow retired officers and others who may not have wanted to see a return of Donald Trump. I will encourage them to do the same. Second, I am deeply worried about the fact that General Mark Milley is close to the top of Trump's retribution list, his enemies list. And I'm disappointed that not enough other retired senior officers have spoken out about the appalling fact that a former president would use the word hang and his former chairman of Joint Chiefs in the same sentence. And so this is, if people are serious about the clip you just played of the president talking about having a strong military, that means it has to be respected. And it has to be respected because of its oath to defend the Constitution of the United States. And so this is where I think I certainly am going to be very vocal in making sure that Mark Milley is not singled out for retribution. Finally, what makes America's military so effective is our alliances. It's the other nations that we're with. Having friends in Europe, in Canada, in the Indo-Pacific region, in the Middle East, that's what has always made us great. We've never had enough to do it by ourselves. And so I hope that a Trump administration will do everything necessary to assure allies that they can count on us and that we train and exercise with our allies. That will be the key to deterrence.
So, Mark, you have hands-on experience with the last Trump presidency. Do you see risk, but do you also see any potential reward in round two?
Well, certainly there is both risk and opportunity. I think it's fair to say that when Trump won the presidency, there were probably more foreign policy, security policy differences between the British government and the US administration than in any time in my 40 years in public service. And that was with a Conservative government in the UK. So I think with a Labour government, we can expect some sort of choppy waters. But I think what's important about the special relationship is that it's like an iceberg and that 7/8 of it is underneath the surface. And so when it comes to nuclear and intelligence and defense and security, the establishments work so closely together that I don't think it matters that much if there's some choppy water on the surface. So there is also, I think, some opportunities for the UK because unlike President Biden, in fact, Donald Trump is a great Anglophile. I saw that when we had meetings with him when Theresa May was Prime Minister. His mother is Scottish. So there is a sort of natural affinity with the UK that was perhaps lacking with both Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And I think that is actually quite encouraging for the UK. And there's also the opportunities that Donald Trump was a great advocate of Brexit. And after Brexit, Britain has a few more opportunities for independent action than the other Europeans when we were members of the European Union. And I think that could play to our advantage in managing the sort of unpredictability of President Trump.
Okay, so let's go piece by piece, starting with Ukraine, arguably the most consequential for us right now. Donald Trump believes he can bring a negotiated peace. His doubters fear an America First worldview will mean vital weapons and military aid are cut off and some kind of capitulation to Moscow effectively forced. Before I get thoughts from around our virtual table here, let's get the assessment of a key Trump supporter. Greg Swenson is chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. I started by asking him if Donald Trump has a plan for Ukraine, given that in the presidential debate, he wouldn't even say if he wanted Ukraine to win.
Yeah, I think he's very cautious about that. And he's also very cautious about talking about his plan. I mean, I think any time there's a military conflict, I'm not sure it's advisable to be 100% transparent about what you're doing. I think at some point you have to commit to explaining it to the Congress and to the American people. You need their buy-in. But Trump is not president right now. I don't know that if he's got some plan up his sleeve, he'd want to share it. Maybe he doesn't have one. I don't know. You never know with President Trump. So, he's unpredictable. And, perhaps that's helpful sometimes. Perhaps it makes things more difficult sometimes.
And when he said, I think it's in the US's best interest to get this war finished, just get it done, negotiate a deal, does he believe the US has any stake in how it ends, or is it a deal at any price?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I think, look, I don't see President Trump as someone who just wants to lose. It's not his thing. He's, if anything, he's kind of obsessed with winning.
So he's invested in winning in Ukraine then? He would see it as a person?
It depends how you define winning. I think he wants an end to the war. I think first things first, Trump he's a big fan of deterrence, but he is not a fan of, never-ending wars. So I think he's clearly incented to end it. And if that means there'll be some concessions that some people will not like, I don't think anybody's going to walk away happy. But, I think his view is that if we just aim to continue this thing, there's no end game in sight. And that's one of the flaws with Biden. He never really defined what the end game is. He didn't explain it to the American people or to the Congress. And I think that made it really incremental. Biden was very cautious at the beginning about giving the wrong weapons to Ukraine. for fear of escalation, which is a pretty consistent theme with Biden. I think, Trump probably would have been, I kind of agree with him. This probably wouldn't have happened if Trump was president. It is interesting. I don't know that it's 100% causal. It might just be correlated, but, there was no war started, a major war started, when he was president. And I think, peace through strength, of course, and deterrence and threats, if something was troubling him, he was not afraid to wave the big stick. So I think a little more clarity from President Biden would have been better. But I do think that Trump wants to end the war. That's not to suggest he wants to just lose the war. And that would be losing if he just walked away and gave Putin everything he wanted.
That was Greg Swenson of Republicans Overseas. General Ben, there was a very diplomatically positive tweet from President Zelensky congratulating President-elect Trump. I wonder, what are you hearing from the people you know in Ukraine? How do they feel about the result?
Well, of course, President Zelensky did the right thing, which was to immediately reach out and offer his congratulations from one head of state to another. And of course, Ukraine is fighting for their survival, and having a continued American support will be important to that survival. I do want to just challenge one thing that Greg mentioned. The war in Ukraine was going on for the entirety of the 4 years of the Trump administration. So to somehow claim, as President Trump, candidate Trump did, that there was no war when he was president, of course, that's a fairy tale. But I'll leave that aside. I think that Ukrainians are concerned, but they also have no intention of just rolling over just because the American president makes a deal of some sort with the Russian president. And I think also other countries in the region, particularly Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, I don't think they'll just acquiesce to whatever is done between the American president and a Russian president as if this was the 18th century somehow, because they will have to deal with the consequences. Millions more Ukrainian refugees, continued disruption of grain and energy, an emboldened Russian presence in the region. So what I hope is that our European allies will implore a President Trump to defend what matters to all of us, which is sovereignty of borders, and to stand up to Russia and figure out a way to give him credit for doing it, but don't accept a status quo where Russia is rewarded with 20% of Ukraine, including Crimea, the most important part of Ukraine. I think this is what people are concerned about. And I do believe that Trump, what Greg said about Trump not wanting to be seen as a loser, he will not want to have this a lost Ukraine hung around him if he rolls over for the Kremlin.
And briefly, Ben, you've been critical of the Biden administration and others in NATO for dragging their feet on weapons supplies. There is a school of thought that says this election result could be good for Ukraine. Trump can be persuaded to better arm them, which would at the very least improve their negotiating position.
Well, I have been critical of the Biden administration for a total failure to do something that Professor Clarke would have taught in his first day of strategy class. You have to identify the strategic objective. What is the purpose for doing this? And the administration failed to do that for 4 years, keeping in mind that this war started 10 and a half years ago. So instead of the start point being, how do we get to a better negotiating position, the start point for the Trump administration should be, what do we want this to look like at the end of the day? What is our strategic objective? Without a proper objective, it's impossible to develop effective policy. And so all of these nonsensical policies of the Biden administration, for example, you cannot use ATACMS against Russian airfields, makes no sense. But that's because there's no clearly identified strategic objective. President Trump will have the opportunity to fix that.
And Mike, one of the suggestions being floated is that America carries on arming Ukraine and sends a bill too, but only to be paid at some undetermined time when it has the money. So a loan. Is that realistic, Mike?
Well, it's not completely unrealistic to say that Ukraine can be given big loans. I mean, there's still discussion about how to use the frozen Russian assets, $350 billion worth of frozen assets. And some of that is being used. That is the interest that has been accruing since it was frozen is being used in fairly ingenious ways. And one can imagine the United States getting right behind the idea of saying, give, half of those assets or whatever to Ukraine. Now, there's lots of reasons why you might not want to do that legally and so on. But that's not the problem in a way. The problem is whether supplying for the United States, supplying Ukraine with the weapons it needs prolongs the war, which the Trump administration has said must come to an end fairly quickly. So it's not a question of the finance really. It's the willingness to take a decision which says we want the Ukrainians to do much better on the battlefield, and then we'll talk about negotiations, as opposed to we've got to negotiate or make them negotiate as soon as possible.
So Mark, Mike is fond of telling us the enemy always gets a vote. Any idea what Moscow's calculus is right now?
Well, I think that's a very good point I was going to make, that it's not obvious that President Putin would accept an immediate sort of ceasefire and the status quo. He hasn't achieved his initial war games in any form at all, in his war aims, and he probably has greater ambitions of territorial gain in Ukraine, and he will certainly want a guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality in exchange for ceasing the conflict. So it's not obvious that Putin will welcome a Trump-imposed, as it were, settlement on day one. And I think there's another aspect worth bearing in mind is China, because China is watching this conflict extremely carefully. On the one hand, it is deterring China from doing something militarily against Taiwan because they realize that actually, in military terms, that task is even more difficult than what Putin faced in Ukraine. But the corollary is also the true, that if the West is seen to give in and concede to Putin on Ukraine, that sends a very damaging message about what the West would be prepared to do if President Xi decided to move on Taiwan.
Mike, Joe Biden is still president for another 2.5 months. Does he have any scope to box President Trump in or make a meaningful change in that time?
Well, I don't think he can box a future president in, but I think it's entirely likely that Joe Biden will try to make sure that all of the $62 billion allocation for aid to Ukraine is spent, that there may be a surge in supplies to Ukraine within that envelope. And I think Joe Biden will be thinking about his legacy, and I'm sure he will want to do whatever he can. And this is one of the things that Kiev is banking on. He'll want to do everything that he can to put them in a better position for the point at which the transition takes place in January, and then we'll see how Trump's policy will work itself out. Although we'll have a fair idea where Trump's policy is before then, because as some people have said, President-elect Trump will be on the phone to Putin pretty quickly from now on. So I do think that Ukraine's situation in the next 70-odd days may improve temporarily, because I think Joe Biden will want it to. But how far he can go with that, of course, is constrained by the envelope, the financial envelope that he's got through in March earlier on this year.
Okay, well, let's take a wider view of President-elect Donald Trump's foreign and defense policy. Once again, there was plenty of rhetoric in the campaign, but not much detail. So what can we expect the reality to be? Here's Greg Swenson again of Republicans Overseas UK.
So I think he's going to pick up where he left off. Trump increased military spending. He was very vocal about, rebuilding of the military. He's a very big fan of peace through strength. So I'd expect that to continue, or return to that, I should say.
On NATO, he was a disruptor in his first term. On the campaign trail, he carried it right on. I just want to play a clip from a rally last February.
One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, no, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay.
Really interesting listening to that. And you said earlier that there were no conflicts started under his watch. But when you hear him saying something like that, you could be arguing he's provoking the next one.
Yeah, I think it was a little reckless. A lot of his rhetoric is reckless. And that's his style. But, he seems to think that it works. And the funny thing is, most of the time it does work. When he dressed down the Germans in 2018, everybody at the diplomatic circles were all freaking out. And how could he say stuff like that to the foreign minister of Germany? It is a little disruptive, to use your word, and sometimes it ends up working. I thought Mike Pompeo was a lot more disciplined than President Trump, but he also was very stern and insisted that our allies, meet their commitments. But he also insisted that no red lines were crossed with our adversaries. And I think the combination of the two were very effective. Does he use kind of unfiltered, unfortunate? I'll agree. Sometimes the language is unfortunate. I don't think Trump would ever do that. That's his clumsy way of saying to everybody, meet your 2% commitment. I think it was taken way too serious.
Just finally, Greg, does Donald Trump believe European security matters to the US, or does he think it's irrelevant?
No, I think he knows it matters. I think, like most presidents, including Obama, there's definitely a tilt toward Asia. But I also think he and many others in Washington feel like if there is a tilt toward Asia, that doesn't mean we're abandoning Europe. But Europe is the rich part of the world, countries that should and can look after themselves. I don't mean without our help, and we'll always be there. But it would be a lot more efficient for everybody if the European militaries were in much better shape, so that we could allocate more resources to Asia. That doesn't mean allocate all of our resources, but just have enough strength. We don't have the capabilities right now of fighting a two-front war. Again, I think the U.S. should be at 5% of GDP, and that would be of great benefit to the Europeans and to NATO.
Greg Swenson from Republicans Overseas UK, thank you so much.
Great to be here. Thanks a lot.
Ben, 9 months ago, we did an edition of Sitrep that was titled Trump-Proofing Europe. I wonder if you think anything has changed in that time, and if this will change anything now.
Well, I'm always struck with supporters of candidate Trump who have to explain what he meant. I mean, we're not talking about a local county official. We're talking about the president of the United States, and what he says matters. And yet his supporters always talk about, well, he didn't mean that. This was just Trump being Trump. What a dangerous situation when you're talking about a person who's the leader of the United States of America, and our adversaries as well as our friends are trying to decipher, okay, was he serious this time, or was this just rhetoric, or, what's going on? And I think I can only hope that he will be disciplined and clear in what he has to say, so that we don't have a terrible miscalculation by the Russians or the Chinese or others about what the U.S. will or won't do, and that our allies can always count on us. Now, I agree with what was just said about I think President Trump will appreciate and understand, and certainly the people around him, especially in the Congress. I mean, most Republicans in Congress are transatlanticists, people like Chairman Mike Turner or Senator Lindsey Graham, Rubio. These guys, Marjorie Taylor Greene is not the normal congressperson when it comes to views about Europe. So I think the Republican part of the Congress will press the president and his administration to make sure we don't screw ourselves, because American prosperity is tied to European prosperity. It's our biggest trading partner collectively is Europe. And that means European prosperity depends on stability and security in Europe. So it's in our interest. Secondly, what the United States has in Europe, very, very small bits of it would be needed in the Indo-Pacific region. So this is kind of a false choice that we would have to pull all this U.S. Army Europe or U.S. Air Force Europe, pull it out of Europe because we need it in the Pacific. That's just not true. What's needed in the Pacific is Navy stuff. And we have, I think, maybe on a typical day, about 5 ships of U.S. Navy Europe that are based in Europe. And most of them are used to help provide air and missile defense for Israel in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think that's kind of a false choice that's laid out. I would say, I would encourage my European friends to no longer use this Trump-proofing kind of phrase. I know it was kind of cool to say that around Brussels and in Berlin and in The Hague and that sort of thing. but it is very offensive particularly to Republicans. And like him or not, he is the president of the United States. And so the best thing that has happened, I think, in the last couple of years is that the alliance is on track to have NAC approved, North Atlantic Council approved regional defense plans. The work done by General Cavoli to earn the confidence of the North Atlantic Council is so important, because now you can have plans, and it is from plans that you get requirements. So 2% is a mechanism because we had no actual requirements. Now, when you have requirements that are generated by the actual plans, then ministers of defense, chiefs of defense can go to their government, to their parliament, and say, look, we signed up to provide, to do this, this, and this. We need, therefore, this, this, and this. I think this will be much more compelling when it comes to defense investment than, 2%, 3%, whatever.
Since you mentioned it, Mike, we were talking last week about the balancing act of the budget and the ongoing UK defence review. How much does this impact the thinking of that review? It's a project that's meant to look decades ahead, but still.
Yeah, I mean, and it won't affect the substance of what is being worked through in that review, but it does add to a sense of urgency to make sure that what it comes up with can be implemented reasonably quickly. And it raises the stakes, of course. And just going back to something that General Ben said, is really important, that one of the strengths of the Western world is its collective nature, its alliances, its arrangements. And that, of course, is what both China and Russia want to break down. They always want to deal bilaterally because their own strength dealing bilaterally is greater than when they have to deal with a collective group of Western nations, whether it's economically or in defense terms. And the thing that is interesting, again, as General Ben says, there's not necessarily any sort of great slippage away from transatlanticism within mainstream American thinking. But Trump himself is a naked transactionalist, as it is said, as a business person. And he himself prefers bilateral relations. He doesn't like collective groups. He doesn't perform terribly well in front of them. When he goes to summits, he tries to wreck them, mainly, I think, because he doesn't feel that he can control them. So if he can't control them, he wrecks them. So his own instinct is to be a bilateralist. And I think that somehow the British approach has got to recognize that, at least for the next 4 years, and still maintain this focus in a very multipolarity dominated world, a world which will become even more multipolar by the 2030s, 2040s. But nevertheless, what is collective about the West is still very, very important to us. And so they've got to navigate the next 4 years with President Trump's own instincts to be bilateral and try to moderate that as against the collectiveness that we still regard as fundamental to our particular security in Britain.
Yeah, Mike makes a very good point there, because I think the greatest concern that the British government had during the first Trump administration was his not believing that American leadership of the free world and defender of the rules-based international order was actually in America's interests, because he took a more bilateralist transactional approach. But that world order is fundamental for Britain's security and prosperity. And that is a great concern about President Trump coming back. We talked earlier about Trump's unpredictability and his fiery rhetoric. That can work with enemies, but it scares the hell out of America's allies. But it has had some impact, because when President Trump came into office last time, only 5 NATO countries were spending 2% of their GDP on defense. Now it's 21 countries. So there has been an increase. And today, the 47 European leaders are meeting in Budapest precisely to look at what further decisions may now be necessary in order not just to support Ukraine, but also to bolster wider European security in the wake of a president coming in who may be less focused on Europe and more focused on the Far East.
And so, Mark, when you talk about Trump's fiery rhetoric, looking beyond Europe and specifically at China, how do you think it will respond to his hardball rhetoric and the reality that may follow?
Well, I think there's less welcome in Beijing for President Trump than there is in Moscow, because the Chinese value stability and predictability above all things. And they are, I think, very concerned about the return of a more unpredictable American leader. I mean, of course, he's talked about 60% tariffs, 200% tariffs on electric cars and things, which could lead to a major global trade war. But I think it's the unpredictability of President Trump that is of most concern in Beijing. So I'm not sure that they are popping the champagne corks quite as President Putin, no doubt, is in the Kremlin.
Middle East is on a knife edge. One claimed success of Trump's first term was the Abraham Accords between Israel and some Arab neighbours. What do you think term two will bring to that current situation?
Well, life has moved on a lot in the Middle East, of course, since Trump's first administration, with this conflict over the last year and a half. And I think the Abraham Accords they haven't been abrogated, which is striking in itself, but they are put on ice, essentially, and will be as long as this conflict between Israel and its neighbors continues. But I think we'll see more continuity of American policy on this, because if anything, Donald Trump will be willing to give Netanyahu a pretty free rein on how he tackles his enemies. The one red line I'm sure he will draw is not sucking America into an offensive military operation against Iran.
Well, of course, I agree with Sir Mark there that Prime Minister Netanyahu will feel he has a free hand now, whether that's true or not. But I think at this point, they will feel they can do whatever they need or want to do in Gaza, for example, without fear that a Trump administration will be pressing them the way that a Biden, or if there had been a Harris administration, on the excessive use of force amongst the Palestinians, for example. Now, I think that's problematic because the Saudis are going to be reluctant to become fully engaged in the Abraham Accord as long as the Palestinians are getting pounded by the Israelis. I mean, that creates a problem, I think, for a Trump administration to develop further the potential of the Abraham Accords if you've got Israeli Defense Force continuing to kill lots of Palestinians. That will be problematic. So that will have to be sorted somehow. On the other hand, again, thinking strategically, adopting a Russia first policy, much the way Roosevelt and Churchill did, to defeat Russia first, the way they agreed to defeat Nazi Germany first, would lead to the isolation of Iran, which is already in a very weak position. And so if we could encourage the administration to look at helping Israel by isolating Iran, which would be one of the side effects of defeating Russia, then I think there's potential there that helps Israel and brings about a better result in the Middle East with a defeated or much weaker Iran. I have to make one last comment that I failed to make earlier, if you'll allow me. It will be interesting to see when Putin or Medvedev or Lavrov uses the nuclear word after Trump becomes president. When do they start putting out their red line warnings again? If the Trump administration decides to allow Ukraine to use ATACMS, for example, against targets inside Russia, this will be an early test, I think.
Kate, I think also the Middle East is one area where President Biden does have some room for maneuver over the next 2.5 months. I remember very well President Obama trying to box in the first President Trump in 2016, particularly using the United Nations. And I think it won't be that surprising if there is a move by certain countries at the UN to put forward a resolution in the Security Council on parameters for a two-state solution, which the Biden administration would not veto. And that would set a sort of line in the sand which protects the possibility of a future Palestinian state, something that Netanyahu would find very unhelpful.
Now, a president can't govern alone. They need a cabinet, officials and military chiefs to advise, discuss, and then do as asked. They're among what are often called the guardrails of the US system of government. Last time round, President Trump had many former top military officers into some of those posts. Almost all fell out with him very publicly, and he said hiring some of them was his only regret about last time round. Well, some of those ex-Trump staffers helped form a group known as NSL-4A, National Security Leaders for America. And in this election, they backed Kamala Harris. More than 250 retired admirals and generals signed that letter of endorsement, including Brigadier General Peter Schwach.
President Trump in the last administration was frustrated because he brought in, or was encouraged to bring in, some very, very competent, patriotic, but I'd say everybody in their own mind space is patriotic. But, leaders, senior leaders, generals especially, that kind of understood their role, understood the Constitution and their role in that. And they became, much to his frustration and at times fury, guardrails.
Is he your biggest concern, the people with whom he surrounds himself, then, that they may be yes men and women?
More so this time than last time. I think because by the end of his first term, all his generals, short one or two of them, were gone. And it leaves a lot of distaste for the military, both active and retirement. When you say that your former chairman of the Joint Chiefs was a traitor and should be executed, or soldiers that had been captured or killed in war were losers, this doesn't compute. It doesn't work. And so increasingly you had men and women who, by definition, are loyal, but not blindly loyal. And this is what the former president was looking for. And that's why you saw General Milley fell away, General Mattis fell away, and General McMaster, and so on. I know some of these gentlemen, and I think this time, we've been hearing that there's already been a very, very strong vetting going on and who's going to be the next cabinet, which will be very, very important. Soon to be President Trump wants his way.
And how much of a difference can the military chiefs of staff who will remain in post through the transition, how much difference can they make?
The senior leaders that are, appointed through Congress, selected by the president and his team, and then Congress, they can make a huge difference just by offering good advice and playing the balance to keeping us, as our allies would expect of us, to be correct in decision isn't always correct, but correct in how we do things, our processes. You don't want anger, you don't want fury, you don't want pride, you don't want emotion to dominate decision-making. That will happen. But I think that's why you need to have a very, very straight-minded, good group of senior men and women.
What do you think is the best you can hope for from a Donald Trump presidency and how he deals with the world beyond the US?
Well, what we have now is Donald Trump and his team have the experience of the first 4 years. And they will take a lot of those lessons learned. And one of our concerns is that, one hopes they learn some good lessons about consistency, predictability, rationality in our policy, working with allies and all that. But what is happening shortly is they are going to be new people, and we hope that this is a thinking group and not a rubber stamp, because Putin and others out there are watching very, very closely.
Peter Schwach, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
All the best, our allies. Cheers.
General Ben, you were also a signatory to that Harris endorsement by the NSL-4A. Do you have any idea about how the current serving generals and admirals feel about and might handle working with President Trump, given the fallings out of his first term?
Well, of course, it is always the prerogative of the president to nominate who he wants on his team, whether we're talking about uniform or civilian leadership. That's his prerogative. And then the Senate has to confirm whoever the president nominates. That's the process. And I also believe in the old adage that people is policy. In other words, who he picks for positions will reveal direction and how the president thinks about certain things. So who he picks for Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, at not just the top level, but the next two levels down, will say a lot about direction of the administration. I am worried that the Trump administration plans to remove all of the senior U.S. military that are currently in post. Not for any sort of competence thing. These are remarkably talented women and men at the 4-star level that are chiefs of services as well as chairman and vice chairman. But I think that there is a sense among some of them that Trump will come in and remove them all, as is his prerogative. But normally you don't wipe out the whole military leadership the way you do all the political ambassadors, for example, who always resign immediately at the end of the previous administration. This is different. And if he does that, I don't know that he will, but if he does that, that means that there's a litmus test out there, something beyond professional competence and adherence to your oath to support and defend the Constitution. I will be very anxious if there is a litmus test of some sort, unspoken, that checks the loyalty to make sure that if he says something, that the chief of the Army or the Navy or the chairman will do exactly what he said, versus saying, well, Mr. President, that's not constitutional. We can't do that. You can't use the military to do this thing. My sense is that he and his team will want to remove or not have anybody in uniform that would offer that. I don't know that. That's my sense.
It's quite a thought. So, Mark, the Vice President-elect, J.D. Vance, is a veteran, so there will be a voice of experience in the White House. But do you share those same concerns that General Ben expressed there? And how important do you think it is to have that military experience there, have a seat at the table?
Well, I think it is very important. In the National Security Council in both countries now, you have the military sitting around the table along with the civilian leaders, and they need to be prepared to speak truth to power. And that's something that President Trump found difficult in his first administration. People who disagreed with him left the White House either voluntarily or were kicked out quite quickly. You know, in the relatively short period I overlapped to the first sort of 4 or 5 months of the Trump presidency after inauguration, I had 3 opposite numbers as national security advisor. So the turnover was remarkably rapid. And I think this time, the only people who will agree to go into the White House are those who are true believers or people who are yes men and are not prepared necessarily to speak truth to power, at least in the early months. And that, as General Ben was saying, I don't think that is a good decision-making environment.
Final thought, Mike. We've been here before and politicians come and go.
They do, and it's one of the great prejudices of democracy. Democracy always thinks that somehow it is in tune with the times, and we say that, you know, cometh the hour, cometh the man or woman, somehow it'll all be okay. But of course, we all know that sometimes cometh the hour, cometh exactly the wrong sort of man or woman, that the times coincide with exactly the wrong sort of leadership. And at the moment, I mean, slightly over half the American electorate think that the first explanation is the right one, and slightly under half the American electorate think that the second explanation is more likely to be the right one. We'll find out sooner rather than later, I suspect.
And on that note, we shall leave it for this time. Thank you, Mike, General Ben, Sir Mark. Great to have you on Sitrep today. And thank you to all of our guests. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. But don't forget Mike's new podcast, Great British Battle Commanders. It's out now. This week's episode is Dowding, the man behind a few. You can find it wherever he's holding up the flyer. You can't see him. I can. He's holding up the flyer now. You can see it wherever you get your podcasts, or watch it on Forces News YouTube channel. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.